What if everything we think we know about early European history is missing a chapter? Not a small detail, not a lost king or a forgotten battle, but an entire civilization, powerful, advanced, and mysteriously erased. Imagine waking up in a world where the ruins of massive cities surround you, but no one remembers who built them. The official story says your ancestors were simple farmers living in forests, but the land beneath your feet whispers something very different. Across Eastern Europe and Eurasia, historians have long debated the origins of the Slavic peoples. Textbooks describe gradual migrations, scattered tribes, and the slow formation of medieval states. It sounds orderly, logical, and safe. But when researchers look closer at the evidence, strange gaps begin to appear. Many of the most important chronicles describing early Slavic history only exist as later copies. The originals are gone. Not damaged, not archived somewhere, simply gone. That alone might not sound suspicious. After all, ancient materials decay. But here's the strange part. Manuscripts from other cultures, even older ones, have survived. Byzantine texts from the early centuries still exist. Egyptian papyri thousands of years old can be viewed in museums today, yet key early Slavic originals are missing entirely. Instead, history relies on transcriptions made centuries later. Now imagine trying to reconstruct your family's entire past using only stories retold many generations after the fact. Details change, names shift, events get simplified. Over time, the original truth becomes impossible to verify. This is the puzzle historians face, and it opens the door to a disturbing possibility. What if early European history wasn't just lost, but selectively rewritten? Some researchers point to legends and controversial texts that hint at a different narrative. Stories describing massive migrations from deep within Eurasia toward the west, not slow, peaceful movement, but urgent, repeated waves of people abandoning lands behind them. In these accounts, tribes don't simply relocate, they flee, again and again. Fleeing from what? Environmental disaster is one possibility. History is filled with examples of civilizations collapsing after droughts, plagues, or volcanic eruptions. But the scale suggested by these stories feels larger, almost continental. Entire populations moving across vast distances as if pushed by a force they couldn't resist. If such an event really happened, it would have reshaped the map of Europe long before medieval kingdoms appeared. There's another mystery hiding in plain sight. Across Europe and Asia, ancient cultures often shared surprisingly similar ideas about the structure of the universe. Many believed reality was divided into three realms: the world of the living, the world of divine order, and the unseen realm beyond life. This pattern appears in different mythologies, separated by thousands of miles. Did these ideas develop independently? Or could they trace back to a much older shared tradition? If a large, early civilization once spread knowledge across Eurasia, fragments of its beliefs could have survived in later cultures, distorted but recognizable. Just like pieces of a shattered mirror, each reflecting part of the original image. Archaeology sometimes deepens the mystery instead of solving it. Across the Eurasian steppe, researchers have uncovered remnants of settlements, trade routes, and fortifications, suggesting complex societies existed earlier than once believed. Not primitive villages, but organized communities connected across enormous distances. These discoveries hint that the story of Europe's formation may be far more complicated than the neat timelines shown in classrooms. And then there's the human factor. Throughout history, wars and revolutions have repeatedly destroyed archives, libraries, and cultural centers. When cities burn, documents vanish. When regimes change, narratives change with them. Victors often decide which histories survive and which disappear into ash. Over centuries, this process can quietly reshape collective memory. Think about how fragile knowledge really is. One fire can erase thousands of books. One conflict can scatter generations of scholarship, and once originals are gone, later copies become the only surviving version of events. Even if those copies were altered, simplified, or misunderstood, future generations may never know. This doesn't mean historians are hiding secrets or that every missing manuscript proves a conspiracy, but it does remind us of something important. History isn't just a record of the past, it's also a record of what survived. So what if the early Slavs weren't simply isolated tribes emerging from forests, but descendants of a much older network of cultures stretching across Eurasia? What if the migrations recorded in scattered legends were echoes of a real, large-scale upheaval? And what if pieces of that forgotten world still exist today, hidden in myths, languages, and archaeological remains we haven't fully understood yet? The truth is, the deeper we look into ancient history, the more we realize how much remains uncertain. The past isn't a finished puzzle. It's a box of scattered fragments, some clear, some damaged, and many still missing. Every new discovery forces us to reconsider what we thought was settled. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that a secret superpower definitely existed, and not that history is entirely wrong, but that the story of human civilization is far more complex, fragile, and mysterious than we often assume. Because somewhere beneath modern cities, under fields, forests, and forgotten ruins, the evidence of earlier worlds may still be waiting. And each time archaeologists dig a little deeper, they're not just uncovering artifacts, they're uncovering questions. Questions about who we really are, questions about where we came from, and questions about how much of our past is still missing. If you're fascinated by hidden histories, ancient mysteries, and the untold stories behind the civilizations we think we know, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because in the next investigation, we're diving even deeper into the clues that could reshape our understanding of the ancient world, and you won't want to miss it. To understand how a civilization could vanish from memory, we need to look at how civilizations actually collapse. History shows that societies rarely disappear in a single dramatic moment. More often, the fall begins quietly. Trade routes weaken, climates shift, crops fail, political systems fracture, people migrate, knowledge becomes harder to preserve. And then, when crisis finally hits, the structure that once held everything together collapses faster than anyone expected. Imagine a vast cultural network stretching across Eurasia. Not necessarily a single empire with one ruler, but a connected world of trade, shared beliefs, and communication. Cities linked by roads, craftsmen sharing techniques, priests or scholars preserving cosmology and law. For generations, this system functions so smoothly that people assume it will last forever. Then, something changes. It might begin with environmental stress. Scientists know that even small shifts in climate can transform entire regions. A prolonged drought can empty rivers, destroy agriculture, and force migrations. A series of harsh winters can cripple food supply chains. A massive volcanic eruption, even one thousands of miles away, can cool the planet and trigger famine. These aren't hypothetical risks. They've happened repeatedly throughout human history. When such stress hits a highly interconnected society, the consequences multiply. Cities dependent on distant grain shipments suddenly face shortages. Trade caravans stop moving because roads become unsafe. Local conflicts erupt over resources. People begin abandoning settlements in search of stability elsewhere. Now, picture what happens to written records during such chaos. Libraries aren't evacuated first. Archives don't travel easily. Scrolls, tablets, and manuscripts are heavy, fragile, and often considered less urgent than food or weapons. When populations flee, knowledge stays behind. Fires, looting, and decay finish the job. Within a few generations, survivors may remember that their ancestors came from somewhere else, but the details blur. Stories turn into legends. Exact locations become symbolic places. Over centuries, memory compresses into myths about lost homelands, wandering tribes, or golden ages that ended in disaster. This pattern isn't unique to one culture. Similar narratives appear all over the world. Ancient Near Eastern texts speak of cities abandoned after catastrophic floods. Mediterranean traditions describe migrations following the collapse of Bronze Age kingdoms. Even in Northern Europe, legends tell of ancestral lands lost to upheaval. Could early Slavic migration stories belong to this broader human pattern? Linguistics offers one intriguing clue. Languages don't spread randomly. When related languages appear across vast territories, it usually means people moved, interacted, or shared a common origin. The Slavic language family today stretches from Central Europe deep into Eastern Europe and parts of Asia. That's an enormous area for closely related languages to occupy. For such linguistic similarity to exist, there must have been either rapid expansion or long-standing communication networks connecting distant populations. Either scenario suggests a more dynamic early history than the image of isolated forest tribes slowly evolving on their own. Archaeology adds another layer. Excavations across the Eurasian steppe reveal evidence of long-distance exchange networks thousands of years old. Metalwork styles, burial traditions, and trade goods show that communities separated by huge distances were still connected culturally. These weren't random contacts. They were structured relationships that lasted centuries. If those networks weakened or collapsed, entire regions could experience population shifts. Communities at the center might disperse outward, carrying fragments of their culture with them. Over time, their descendants would adapt to new environments, developing new identities while still preserving traces of their shared past in language, mythology, and customs. From this perspective, the story of Slavic origins may not be about a single birthplace or a sudden appearance in history. Instead, it might represent the aftermath of a much older, wider cultural world gradually fragmenting. There's also the question of how later states shaped historical narratives. When medieval kingdoms formed, rulers needed legitimacy. They needed origin stories that explained why their authority was natural and rightful. Chroniclers often wrote histories connecting current dynasties to heroic founders, sacred missions, or ancient tribes. In doing so, they sometimes simplified or reorganized earlier traditions. Complex migrations became neat genealogies. Diverse cultural influences were condensed into a single national origin. Over time, these official versions entered textbooks and became accepted as the primary narrative. This doesn't mean chroniclers were intentionally deceptive. Many worked with the information available to them, combining oral traditions, earlier writings, and political expectations. But the result could still reshape how future generations understood the past. Another factor to consider is how easily physical evidence disappears. Organic materials like wood, leather, and early paper degrade quickly unless preserved in very specific conditions. Even stone structures can vanish if later populations reuse the materials. Entire cities have been dismantled and repurposed, their stones carried off to build newer settlements. When archaeologists uncover ancient sites today, they're often only seeing a fraction of what once existed. The absence of evidence doesn't always mean absence of civilization. Sometimes it simply means the evidence didn't survive. Modern technology is beginning to change that. Satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and advanced dating techniques allow researchers to detect buried structures and map ancient landscapes without digging extensively. In recent years, these tools have revealed previously unknown settlements, roads, and fortifications across Eurasia. Each discovery challenges the assumption that ancient populations were sparse or disconnected. Instead, the emerging picture shows dense patterns of habitation and movement, suggesting a world far more interconnected than previously imagined. So, where does this leave us? Not with proof of a forgotten superpower ruling Eurasia, but with a growing recognition that early European and Slavic history may be incomplete. The traditional narrative might capture part of the truth, while other parts remain buried, lost, or waiting to be interpreted in new ways. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes the search so fascinating. Because history isn't static. It evolves with every new excavation, every reanalyzed manuscript, every technological breakthrough. What seems impossible today can become accepted tomorrow once enough evidence accumulates. The idea of a lost cultural network or major ancient upheaval might sound dramatic, but history is full of surprises. Civilizations we once thought primitive turn out to have complex engineering. Trade systems we assumed local turn out to span continents. Timelines we believed fixed shift earlier or later as new data emerges. The deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that humanity's past is not a straight line of simple progress. It's a tangled web of rises, falls, migrations, and rediscoveries. And somewhere inside that web may lie the missing chapters that explain how the Slavic world and Europe itself truly came to be. If those chapters exist, they won't be found in a single dramatic discovery. They'll emerge piece by piece, a settlement uncovered here, a linguistic link identified there, a forgotten manuscript reevaluated with modern tools. Slowly, patiently, the past reveals itself. And when it does, it often turns out to be far more extraordinary than the stories we grew up hearing. Stay with me, because in the next part, we'll explore some of the most intriguing archaeological findings and cultural clues that hint at just how advanced and interconnected ancient Eurasian societies may have been, and why those clues might change how we see the origins of Europe forever. One of the biggest misconceptions about the ancient world is that progress always moved forward in a straight, predictable line. We tend to imagine early societies as small, isolated, and technologically simple, slowly evolving into the complex civilizations we know today. But archaeological discoveries over the past century have repeatedly shattered that assumption. Across Eurasia, researchers have uncovered evidence of settlements that were far more organized than anyone expected for their time. Not just clusters of huts, but structured communities with planned layouts, defensive systems, specialized crafts, and long-distance trade connections. These weren't accidental developments. They required knowledge, cooperation, and stability. Take ancient trade routes, for example. Long before the famous Silk Road formally connected East and West, smaller exchange networks already crossed the continent. Amber from the Baltic has been found in Mediterranean sites. Metal objects traced to Central Asian sources have appeared thousands of miles away. Such finds reveal that people weren't confined to their local regions. Goods, ideas, and technologies traveled vast distances. Where trade flows, information follows. If merchants could carry materials across continents, they could also carry stories, religious concepts, engineering techniques, and linguistic influences. Over generations, these exchanges create shared cultural patterns across enormous areas. That's how architectural similarities, mythological parallels, and technological knowledge can appear in places that seem unrelated on the surface. Now imagine what happens if such a network weakens or collapses. Trade stops, communication fragments, communities that once shared knowledge become isolated. Over time, their cultures diverge. Each region adapts differently, preserving some traditions while losing others entirely. Centuries later, historians looking back might see only separate civilizations, never realizing they were once part of a much larger connected system. Some archaeologists believe this exact process may have happened multiple times throughout Eurasian history. Instead of one continuous rise of civilization, there may have been cycles of integration and fragmentation, periods when cultures became widely interconnected, followed by disruptions that scattered populations and reset regional development. This cyclical view helps explain why certain technologies or cultural practices seem to appear suddenly in different places. Rather than being invented independently, they may have spread earlier through networks that later vanished from the historical record. Another fascinating clue comes from ancient fortifications found across Eastern Europe and the steppe regions. Some sites show defensive structures and settlement planning that suggest organized leadership and coordinated labor. Building such systems requires more than basic survival skills. It implies social structure, resource management, and long-term planning. When multiple settlements across a region share similar defensive designs or construction methods, it often indicates communication or shared tradition. That doesn't necessarily mean a single empire controlled them, but it does point to a broader cultural sphere influencing how communities built and defended themselves. Burial practices also tell a powerful story. Archaeologists often learn more from graves than from ruins. Burial sites reveal social hierarchy, spiritual beliefs, and connections between groups. In many parts of Eurasia, burial mounds and rituals show striking similarities across vast distances, suggesting cultural continuity or shared ancestry among populations separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles. These patterns hint at something important. The people who eventually formed Slavic societies may not have emerged suddenly in medieval history. Instead, they may represent one branch of a much older and more widespread cultural landscape. If that's true, then early Slavic history isn't just about when a specific tribe first appeared in written records. It's about understanding how populations across Eurasia interacted long before chroniclers began documenting events. And this is where the mystery deepens, because written records are only one form of history, and often the most fragile one. Oral traditions, material culture, and linguistic patterns can preserve memories long after documents vanish. Sometimes myths carry echoes of real migrations or environmental events, encoded symbolically rather than literally. For instance, many cultures preserve stories about a great journey, a lost homeland, or a time when their ancestors were forced to move. While these tales are often dismissed as folklore, they sometimes align with archaeological evidence of actual population shifts. Myth, in this sense, becomes a cultural memory, not precise in detail, but rooted in real experience. Could the migration traditions connected to early Slavic peoples reflect such memories? If large groups once moved westward from deeper within Eurasia, whether due to environmental change, conflict, or social collapse, their descendants might retain fragments of that journey in legend and identity. Over centuries, the original causes would fade, leaving only the sense that their ancestors came from elsewhere and endured hardship to reach new lands. Modern genetic research is beginning to shed new light on these questions. By analyzing ancient DNA from archaeological remains, scientists can trace population movements and mixing patterns across time. Early results from Eurasian studies show that human migration has been far more dynamic and complex than once believed. Populations didn't stay fixed in one place for millennia. They moved, merged, separated, and moved again. This genetic evidence supports the idea that Europe's population history is layered, shaped by multiple waves of movement rather than a single origin story. The Slavic expansion documented in early medieval sources may have been only the latest visible phase of a much longer process. And when you combine genetics with archaeology, linguistics, and comparative mythology, a picture begins to form, not of a hidden superempire erased from textbooks, but of an ancient world far more interconnected than traditional narratives suggest. In that world, cultural influence didn't always follow political borders. Knowledge didn't belong to one nation. Ideas flowed along trade paths, through migration, and across generations. Civilizations rose, transformed, and sometimes dissolved, leaving behind descendants who carried only pieces of their heritage forward. Understanding this doesn't diminish history, it enriches it. Because instead of seeing the past as a sequence of isolated civilizations, we begin to see it as a continuous human story, one where the origins of any culture, including the Slavs, are part of a much broader tapestry stretching across continents and centuries. And that realization changes how we look at the evidence still waiting to be uncovered. Because every new excavation in Eastern Europe, every newly analyzed burial site, every fragment of ancient settlement mapped from the air could hold another piece of this enormous puzzle. A puzzle that might reveal how deeply connected the ancient world truly was, and how much of that connection has yet to be fully understood. In the next part, we'll dive into how historical narratives are actually constructed, who writes them, how they evolve, and why some versions of the past become dominant while others fade away. Once you understand that process, you may never look at history books the same way again.